Hey, glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it. This is incredible. Come on, join in.
It started as nothing more than a laugh. Backstage at a private music gathering, the kind where legends feel relaxed enough to drop their guard, the atmosphere was light. Instruments rested against walls, glasses clinked softly, and stories flowed freely among artists who had nothing left to prove. Ozzy Osbourne stood near the edge of the room, dressed simply, smiling quietly as others talked. To most people, he was the Prince of Darkness, wild, unpredictable, and completely removed from anything delicate or refined. Across the room sat Elton John, casually resting near a grand piano, fingers tapping the lid as if it were second nature. Someone joked about classical training, about how real musicians were born at the keys. Ozzy laughed and shrugged. "I never learned music the proper way," he said. "I just felt it." That's when Elton smiled, half playful, half teasing. "Well then," Elton said, nodding toward the piano, "why don't you come over here and play something for us?" The room reacted instantly. A few chuckles, a few raised eyebrows, some outright laughter. Everyone assumed the same thing. This was a setup, a harmless joke. Heavy metal's most notorious voice fumbling through piano keys for a quick laugh. Ozzy paused. For just a moment, it looked like he might brush it off. After all, this wasn't his world. This was Elton's domain, polished, technical, respected. But instead of laughing it away, Ozzy took a slow step forward, then another. The room grew quieter as he approached the piano. The jokes faded into uneasy silence. No one expected him to actually sit down. Ozzy pulled out the bench and sat. He rested his hands above the keys, not touching them yet. The air felt different now, heavier, charged with curiosity. Elton watched closely, still smiling, still expecting nothing serious. Ozzy stared at the piano, breathing steadily. No showmanship, no theatrics, just a man and an instrument. And in that moment, no one in the room realized they were about to witness something that would completely change how they saw him, and leave one of the greatest musicians in the world speechless. Because the joke was about to end. Have you ever been dared to do something you thought you couldn't? How did it turn out?
Saturday night and I'm away. Destination unknown, I'm gonna be crazy.
At first, no one said anything. Ozzy sat at the piano, hands hovering above the keys, while the room waited for the punchline. A few people exchanged looks, the kind that said this is about to be awkward. Then someone laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, but it cracked the silence. Another laugh followed, then another. A producer near the back leaned toward a friend and whispered, "This should be interesting." Someone else smirked and pulled out their phone, not to record art, but to capture what they expected would be a moment of embarrassment. Elton John stood a few feet away, arms folded loosely, posture relaxed. His expression was friendly, even encouraging, but there was no real expectation behind it. To him, this was playful banter, a light-hearted moment where Ozzy would tap a few keys, shrug, and everyone would move on. Ozzy could feel it. He wasn't deaf to the energy in the room, the subtle disbelief, the assumptions. The idea that a man known for screaming into microphones couldn't possibly understand an instrument built for precision and restraint. His fingers twitched slightly above the keys. Someone whispered, "Does he even know what key to start in?" A quiet snicker rippled through the crowd. Ozzy lowered his hands slowly, then stopped. He pulled them back. For a second, it looked like he might stand up and walk away. The laughter softened into a murmur, as if the room collectively leaned forward, waiting to see whether he'd quit or commit. Elton cleared his throat lightly. "No pressure," he said, smiling. "Just have fun." That made a few people laugh again. But Ozzy didn't smile. He took a breath, deep and controlled, and closed his eyes. The room noticed. That small gesture changed something. It wasn't what someone did before a joke. It was what someone did before telling the truth. Ozzy placed his fingers back on the keys, this time with intention, not rushed, Not careless, the laughter faded not completely, but enough that it felt out of place now. A woman near the piano frowned, suddenly unsure why she'd been amused in the first place. A man recording lowered his phone slightly, curiosity replacing mockery. Ozzy's shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed. He wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. He was somewhere else. Inside his head, the noise disappeared, the touring, the critics, the labels, the jokes about being chaotic or untrained. What remained was feeling, memory, darkness and beauty colliding the way they always had in his music. His fingers pressed down, not yet on the keys, just enough to feel their resistance. The room held its breath. Someone coughed, someone shifted their weight. No one laughed now. Elton tilted his head, studying Ozzy more closely. Something about this didn't feel like a gag anymore. The body language was wrong for that. Too focused. Too still. Ozzy adjusted his seat slightly, scooting closer to the piano. A small, practical movement, but one that told the room he wasn't guessing. A voice whispered from the side, "Wait, is he serious?" Ozzy exhaled, and then, finally, he pressed the first key. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was soft, so soft that a few people almost missed it. But that single note cut through the room like a question no one expected to be asked. The laughter died completely. Ozzy followed it with another note, then another, slow, measured, intentional. A melody began to form, not clean and polished, but heavy with emotion. The kind of sound that didn't care about perfection, only honesty. Someone's mouth fell open. A woman near the back whispered, "Oh." Elton's arms dropped to his sides. This wasn't funny. This wasn't random. This wasn't a joke. Ozzy kept playing, eyes still closed, face calm but distant. Each note seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training, from years of sound, silence, pain, and survival. The people who had laughed now stood frozen. Phones rose again, but this time no one was smirking. They were witnessing something they didn't expect. And as the melody grew stronger, one truth settled heavily over the room. They hadn't been laughing at Ozzy. They'd been laughing at their own assumptions. And it was only just beginning. The room didn't move. No one shifted their weight. No one whispered now. The sound coming from the piano had erased everything else, the murmurs, the assumptions, even time itself. Ozzy's fingers continued across the keys, not fast, not flashy, but deliberate. Each note seemed to carry weight, as if it had been waiting years to be heard this way. The melody wasn't something anyone recognized, yet it felt familiar, like a memory you couldn't quite place but somehow understood. Elton stood frozen. This wasn't technique for technique's sake. It wasn't classical brilliance or show-off virtuosity. It was something far more difficult to fake, feeling. Ozzy leaned slightly into the piano, shoulders rising and falling with the rhythm. His hands moved with confidence now, not hesitation. The awkwardness everyone expected never came. A producer near the back whispered, almost afraid to break the spell, "He's not guessing." And he was right. Ozzy wasn't searching for notes, he was choosing them. The melody deepened, drifting into darker territory, minor chords layered with tension, then softened by a gentle resolution. It sounded like the kind of music written at 3 in the morning, when the world is quiet and honesty is unavoidable. A woman near the front wiped her eye, surprised by her own reaction. Someone else swallowed hard. The piano, once just a prop for a joke, now felt like a confessional. Ozzy opened his eyes briefly and looked down at his hands, as if even he was slightly surprised by what was coming out. Then he closed them again, letting instinct take over. This was the same instinct that had carried him through decades of music, through chaos, criticism, and survival. Only now it was stripped bare. No distortion, no screaming crowds, no persona, just sound. Elton stepped closer, slowly, careful not to interrupt. His face had changed completely. The playful grin was gone, replaced by something heavier, recognition. He knew this place. Every great musician does. It's the place where theory ends and truth begins. Ozzy shifted into a higher register, letting the melody breathe. His left hand anchored the piece, steady and grounding, while the right explored, tentative at first, then bold. Someone in the crowd whispered, "This is beautiful." Another person nodded silently, afraid that speaking might break it. The music wasn't clean in the way conservatories teach. A trained ear could catch imperfections, a slightly rough transition, a note held longer than expected. But none of that mattered, because it was real. And real music has a gravity that perfection never will. Ozzy's playing grew more confident, more expansive. He layered emotion the way he always had: tension, release, darkness, light. The same emotional architecture that made his songs legendary was now unfolding in a form no one expected from him. Elton felt a tightening in his chest. He'd spent his life at this instrument, countless hours mastering it, respecting it, understanding its rules. And yet here was Ozzy, breaking none of them, but bending them in a way that felt deeply human. A soft harmony emerged as Ozzy added a simple chord progression underneath the melody. It wasn't complex, but it was intentional, the kind of structure that lets emotion stand front and center. The room leaned in collectively. Ozzy's head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. His fingers followed, responding in real time. This wasn't rehearsed. It couldn't be. It was happening now. And that made it powerful. A man who had laughed earlier lowered his gaze, embarrassed. He suddenly remembered every time he judged someone's talent by their image. The piano grew quieter, the melody slowing, stretching the space between notes. Each pause felt deliberate, like Ozzy was letting the room breathe with him. When the final chord rang out, it lingered in the air. No one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because no one knew how to interrupt the silence. Ozzy's hands rested on the keys. He didn't look up. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, because something irreversible had just happened. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just a rock legend anymore. In that room, at that piano, he was simply a musician, and everyone there knew it. Were you surprised that Ozzy could play like that? Which unexpected talent shocked you the most in real life?
Come on, play that song, the one we love. You got it. Let's do it.
Elton John didn't move. He stood just a few feet from the piano, hands hanging loosely at his sides, eyes fixed on Ozzy as if seeing him for the first time. The final notes still hung in the air, vibrating softly against the walls, refusing to disappear. Elton had heard thousands of piano players in his life, technically flawless ones, fast ones, brilliant ones, but this was different. This wasn't about mastery over the instrument. It was about surrender to it. Ozzy's hands rested quietly on the keys now, fingers still, shoulders slightly slumped as if he'd just put down something heavy. He hadn't looked up. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't waited for applause. He simply sat there, and that's when it hit Elton. The joke hadn't landed the way he expected, not because Ozzy failed, but because Elton had underestimated him. The realization stung. Elton thought back to the moment he gestured toward the piano, half smiling, expecting light entertainment. He'd seen Ozzy through the same narrow lens the world often did. The wild frontman, the chaos, the excess. Not the musician, not the man who had built songs that carried generations. Elton stepped closer, the soft soles of his shoes barely making a sound. He looked down at the keys Ozzy had touched as if they had been changed somehow. They hadn't, but the room had. Elton swallowed. He remembered the early days of his own career, when people laughed at his glasses, his voice, his flamboyance, when he was dismissed before he was heard. The parallel hit hard. Ozzy finally opened his eyes and glanced up, uncertain. There was no pride in his expression, no challenge, just a quiet question, unspoken. Was that okay? That look broke something in Elton, because a man who had nothing left to prove was still worried he might not be enough. Elton shook his head slowly, almost to himself. No, he murmured under his breath, I was wrong. The crowd watched silently as Elton reached out and rested a hand on the piano's edge. His fingers brushed the wood with reverence, the same way he always touched an instrument he respected. But now the respect wasn't just for the piano, it was for Ozzy. The people in the room felt the shift. The air wasn't tense anymore, it was heavy with understanding. No one dared to speak. Elton looked at Ozzy's hands again. They're not trained, he thought, but they were honest, and honesty was something you couldn't teach. Elton straightened, his voice barely above a whisper. You didn't play notes, he said slowly. You told a story. A few people nodded instinctively, relieved someone had finally spoken the truth out loud. Ozzy shrugged lightly, uncomfortable with attention. I just played what I felt. Elton let out a soft, breathless laugh, not amused but humbled. That's the hardest thing to do, he replied. He turned to the crowd, many of whom were still processing what they'd witnessed. Do you know how rare that is? Elton asked, gesturing gently toward Ozzy. To sit down at an instrument and tell the truth without hiding behind skill. No one answered. They didn't need to. Elton looked back at Ozzy, eyes glistening now. He saw more than talent. He saw courage. The courage to sit down knowing people were laughing. The courage to play anyway. The courage to be vulnerable in a room full of judgment. Elton felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't ignore. He had invited Ozzy to the piano as a joke, but Ozzy had turned it into a mirror, and Elton didn't like everything he saw in his own reflection. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, because in that moment, Elton John, one of the greatest musicians alive, understood something deeply uncomfortable and deeply human. He hadn't just misjudged Ozzy's ability, he had misjudged his soul, and that realization was only beginning to sink in.
Ready for this? Let's do it!
For several seconds after Elton spoke, no one moved. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. The kind of silence that follows truth, not shock, but recognition. Ozzy shifted slightly on the bench, uncomfortable with the weight of attention. He had never enjoyed being looked at like this, not as a spectacle, not even as a hero. He cleared his throat. People think metal is just noise, he said quietly, anger, chaos like there's nothing underneath it. He paused, searching for the right words. But that noise, that's where I put everything I couldn't say. No one interrupted him. Ozzy rested his hands on his knees now, palms open. Vulnerable, I never learned how to read music properly. He continued, never had the patience for lessons. I just listened, felt things, tried to survive them. The honesty in his voice caught people off guard. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was a confession. Elton sat down slowly on a nearby stool, eyes locked on Ozzy, listening the way musicians listen when they know something important is being said. When I play loud, Ozzy said, it's not because I don't care about beauty. It's because sometimes beauty hurts too much to whisper. A soft exhale moved through the room. Someone in the back nodded, as if Ozzy had just put words to something they'd felt their whole life. Elton's throat tightened. He'd spent decades defending his own genre, his own style, insisting that pop and piano could be just as meaningful as orchestras and operas. And here he was, realizing he'd quietly done the same thing to someone else. Judged the sound without listening for the pain beneath it. Ozzy looked down at the floor. I didn't sit at that piano to prove anything, he said. I just wanted to show I'm not a joke. The words hit harder than any chord. Elton leaned forward, elbows on his knees now. The distance between legend and legend disappeared. You never were, Elton said softly. But Ozzy wasn't finished. When people laugh, he continued, you start believing maybe they're right. That maybe what you feel doesn't count unless it fits someone else's rules. A long pause followed. Elton closed his eyes briefly. He thought of every time someone had dismissed him for his looks, his voice, his honesty. He thought of how deeply those moments had cut even after success. And now he saw the same scars in Ozzy. Different sound, same wounds. Elton stood up slowly, emotion creeping into his posture, into the way he held himself. You know, he said, voice unsteady, the most dangerous thing we do as musicians is decide who's allowed to be one. The room absorbed that sentence like a weight. Ozzy finally looked up. For the first time that night, their eyes met, not as icons, not as genres, but as two men who had spent their lives translating pain into sound. Elton took a step closer. "I thought I was teasing you," he admitted, "but I see now I was hiding behind a joke." That admission cracked something open. The crowd shifted, some swallowing hard, others blinking back tears. This wasn't drama. It was humility unfolding in real time. Ozzy shrugged again, but his voice softened. "It's all right," he said. "I've been misunderstood before." Elton shook his head. "That doesn't make it okay." He placed a hand gently on Ozzy's shoulder, not as a gesture for the crowd, but as something private made public by accident. "I'm sorry," Elton said. The words were simple, but they carried decades of ego dissolving. No applause followed. No cheers, because this moment wasn't for noise. It was for understanding, and as the room sat in that shared quiet, one thing became painfully clear to everyone present. This wasn't about piano, or metal, or genres. It was about what happens when someone finally listens, and realizes they should have done so much earlier. And for Elton John, that realization was beginning to feel overwhelming. Elton John stood very still. His hand was still resting on Ozzy's shoulder, but it trembled slightly now. Not from nerves, from something deeper. The kind of emotion you don't expect to feel at this stage in life, especially after decades of success, applause, and praise. The room was silent. No phones moved. No one whispered. Everyone sensed they were standing inside a moment that didn't belong to them. Elton took a slow breath, then another. His eyes glistened as he tried, and failed to keep his composure. He turned slightly away, pressing his lips together, as if hoping the feeling would pass. It didn't. "I've spent my whole life at that piano," he said quietly, his voice cracking just enough to give him away. "Learning how to control it, how to make it do what I want." He glanced back at Ozzy. "And tonight, you reminded me that music doesn't come from control." The words hung heavy. Elton's shoulders dropped, the weight of them finally visible. He lifted a hand to his face, wiping at his eyes once, then again. A tear escaped anyway, tracing a line down his cheek. No one gasped, no one reacted, they understood. Elton John wasn't crying because he'd been embarrassed. He was crying because he'd been moved. "I forgot," he continued, voice unsteady now, "what it felt like to just feel something without trying to impress anyone." Ozzy looked at him, startled. He hadn't expected this. He'd sat down to play nothing more. "You didn't just play the piano," Elton said. "You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." Another tear fell. Elton let out a small, broken laugh, the kind that comes when emotion spills over its edges. "I thought I was past being taught lessons," he said. "Turns out I was wrong." He covered his face briefly, shaking his head, overwhelmed. Ozzy stood up slowly from the bench. The movement was quiet, respectful. He didn't rush, he didn't perform. He simply stood and faced Elton. For a moment the two men said nothing. Then Ozzy did something no one expected. He wrapped his arms around Elton and pulled him into a gentle embrace. The crowd inhaled sharply, not in excitement, but in reverence. Elton leaned into it, not as a legend being comforted, but as a human being. He rested his forehead against Ozzy's shoulder, eyes closed, breathing unevenly. The tears came freely now, no longer hidden, no longer resisted. "Thank you," Elton whispered, "for trusting us with that." Ozzy nodded once, his own eyes damp. "We're all just trying to be heard," he said softly. That sentence broke the room. People wiped their eyes openly now. A few turned away, suddenly emotional themselves. This wasn't celebrity drama. It was recognition, the kind that sneaks up on you and leaves you exposed. Elton pulled back slowly, taking a final breath to steady himself. He looked around the room, voice still fragile. "I made a mistake," he said openly, "and I'm grateful it was in front of people who could see me own it." He looked back at Ozzy. "You're not just a singer," Elton said. "You're an artist in every sense of the word." The room finally erupted, not in loud cheers, but in sustained applause. The kind that rises slowly, organically, fueled by respect rather than hype. Elton wiped his face again, smiling through tears now. "I don't cry easily," he admitted with a small laugh, "but this mattered." Ozzy smiled back, modest, almost shy. "Music does that," he said. And in that moment, with tears still drying, egos stripped away, and silence returning, everyone in that room understood something rare. They hadn't just witnessed a performance. They had witnessed a reconciliation between pride and humility, between judgment and listening, between two legends who, for one quiet night, remembered that music isn't about being right, it's about being real. No one planned for the moment to leave the room, but it did quietly at first. Someone had recorded the piano from the side, not expecting anything memorable, just habit. Another had captured Elton wiping his eyes, thinking it might make a touching clip. Neither of them knew what they were holding. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. It didn't have flashy edits, no dramatic captions, just a grainy clip of Ozzy Osbourne at a piano and Elton John crying. The internet did the rest. Within hours, millions of people had watched it, then millions more. Comments poured in from every corner of the world, musicians, fans, critics, people who didn't even listen to rock or piano music. They all seemed to say the same thing: this is what real music looks like. Talent doesn't belong to one genre. I didn't expect this to make me cry. Clips were slowed down, analyzed, reposted. People pointed out Ozzy's hesitation before the first note, Elton's expression shifting in real time, the way the room seemed to disappear as the music took over. But what truly struck people wasn't the piano, it was the humility. Music schools shared the video not to talk about technique, but about listening. Teachers played it for students and asked a simple question: what matters more, perfection or honesty? Ozzy didn't do interviews. He didn't explain himself. When asked about it later, he simply said, "I was just playing what I felt." That made the story grow even larger, because in a world full of explanations, that answer felt rare. Elton did speak. At a later show, seated at his piano, he paused before playing and told the audience, "I was reminded recently that music can still surprise you, especially when you think you know everything." The crowd applauded, not knowing they were being invited into the same lesson. Behind the scenes, something else changed. Musicians who had once been dismissed because of genre began sharing their own stories. Classical players talking about rock. Jazz musicians admitting they'd judged pop. Fans confessing how often they'd decided who was real before listening. The video became a mirror, not because it was perfect, but because it was human. For Ozzy, the moment didn't turn him into something new. It revealed what had always been there. For Elton, it became a reminder that mastery doesn't protect you from blind spots, and that growth doesn't end when fame begins. The two men stayed in touch after that night, not as rivals, not as icons, as musicians, as listeners. This story slowly stopped being about who played better. It became about who listened better, and that's why it lasted, because long after the views slowed and the comments faded, one truth remained louder than any genre, louder than any instrument. Real art doesn't ask to be understood. It asks to be felt. If this story reminded you that talent has no label and emotion has no genre, type music in the comments and subscribe for more powerful stories where legends are humbled and humanity takes center stage. Have you ever been moved to tears by someone else's performance? What was the moment like for you?